Darren Carter, a 17-year-old black teenager, walked through the sophisticated corridors of the Hudson Plaza Mall, the largest and most luxurious mall in the city. Everything around was shiny and expensive, from the unique shop windows to the polished marble floor that reflected the glow of the powerful ceiling lights. Well-dressed people paraded in a hurry, carrying bags of famous brands, while others just strolled around enjoying the windows as if they were works of art. The young man was tightly clutching the credit card he held in his pocket. He had spent months saving every penny he earned from his part-time job at a coffee shop in the city. He had avoided spending on anything unnecessary, had cut out going out with friends, and even put aside small luxuries that he liked to enjoy. Everything for that moment. It was the birthday of his mother, Emily Carter, an admirable and respected woman who always taught him the importance of honesty, effort, and integrity. She was a renowned judge, known not only for her sharp legal skill, but also for her strict stance against social injustices. She was often called upon for difficult and high-profile cases, and Darren knew that his mother's workload was immense. But more than that, Darren knew his mother deserved something special. Not only for what she did professionally, but for the incredible mother she always was. His plan was to buy a high-end watch that she had once mentioned, but that she would never have the courage to buy for herself. Finally, he stopped in front of the store he was looking for. Horologium & Co., a luxury watch store known for selling models that cost more than a popular car. He took a deep breath, feeling his nervousness grow, but decided that wouldn't stop him. He pushed open the elegant glass door and entered. The room was impeccably decorated with dark wood furniture, leather paneling, and lights that highlighted each piece with an almost magical glow. Behind the glass counter, a middle-aged saleswoman, Mrs. Thompson, looked at him with a look of instant suspicion. She was a woman with a hard expression and clothes as impeccable as her posture. Her first reaction when she saw Darren was to frown, as if he shouldn't be there. Darren smiled gently, ignoring the look of reproach, and walked to the counter. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for a special watch to give to my mom. It's her birthday," he said politely. Mrs. Thompson looked at him as if his words made no sense at all. Her eyes scrutinized every detail of the boy's appearance, his simple clothes, his well-groomed hair, but clearly not the standard of the customers who used to frequent that store. "A luxury watch?" His voice came out full of mockery and disbelief. "Are you sure you entered the right store, kid?" Darren ignored the tone of voice and remained calm, something his mother always said was essential in moments of confrontation. "Yes, I'm in the right place. I wanted to see some models that are in the showcase," but instead of showing the watches, the saleswoman crossed her arms and arched an eyebrow. "And can you pay for something from this store?" Darren was a little disconcerted, but he didn't shake him. He took the credit card out of his pocket and placed it on the counter. "I worked hard to get this money. I want to buy a beautiful watch for my mother." Mrs. Thompson looked at the card as if it were a ridiculous object, a fake toy that Darren had taken out of his pocket just to fool her. Instead of picking up the card or opening the window, she did something Darren didn't expect. The saleswoman discreetly picked up the phone and dialed a number, keeping her eyes on him as if he were some kind of threat. "Mall security. This is from Horologium & Co. I need someone to send someone immediately. We have a suspect here, a black boy trying to mess with the jewelry. I'm sure he's going to try to steal something. Come quickly." Darren had no reaction. He had heard clearly every word she spoke. His body froze. The air seemed to have become denser and harder to breathe. He looked around and realized that the few customers in the store were now watching him with looks of distrust and contempt. His mind struggled to process what was happening. All he wanted was to buy a gift for his mother, something that would show how much he valued her. But now, instead of being treated like a customer, he was treated like a criminal, and Darren knew that this would not be a simple purchase. From then on, he would have to face a series of humiliations that not even in his worst nightmares would have imagined. Darren was still standing in front of the counter, still stunned by what he had just heard. His hands were cold, but he tried to remain calm. mentally repeating what his mother always told him. Never lose your head in the face of an injustice. Calm is your best defense. While the saleswoman pretended to fetch something in the back room, clearly trying to buy time until the security guards arrived, Darren watched the clocks in the window. They were beautiful, shiny, delicately made. Exactly the kind of gift he wanted to give his mother. But the tension in the air made it all distant, as if they were just images reflected in a bad dream. It was then that the glass door of the store opened forcefully, making a loud sound that echoed throughout the UI. Brimim, 2 uniformed security guards rushed in, with rigid postures and aggressive looks. One of them, the tallest and most muscular, named Scott, kept one hand close to his belt as if he expected to need to act quickly. The other, narrow-eyed and rude-voiced, named Reed, walked directly toward Darren. "Hey boy, show your hands now," Reed said with an authoritative tone that made it clear that he was not there to listen to explanations. Darren raised his hands automatically, his eyes wide with fright. "What's going on?" "I'm just trying to buy a gift for my mom." "Oh, yes? And do you think we're going to fall for it?" Reed let out a short, cold laugh, as if he was having fun with the situation. "You come in here alone, hang around the counters, and still want us to believe you're going to buy something? But it's the truth. I worked for months for this. I have money, I can afford it," Darren replied, his voice trembling but determined. Scott stepped forward and pushed Darren slightly to the side, causing him to stumble and nearly lose his balance. "Stay still and don't move. Let's see what you're trying to steal." Before Darren could protest, Reed was already running his hands through his pockets, searching him rudely and disrespectfully. The scene attracted curious glances from customers passing by the store, but none of them dared to intervene. It was as if everyone there had accepted that Darren shouldn't be in that place, as if his mere presence was an affront to the luxurious and elitist environment. Nothing here, Reed muttered as he pushed Darren away and forced him to keep his hands up. "Look what we have here," Scott said, holding the credit card Darren had placed on the counter moments before. He waved the card in front of Darren's face as if it were a piece of garbage. "Where did you get that, boy? Did you steal from someone while you were out there?" Darren felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't want to show weakness. "I worked to get this money. This card is mine. I'm not stealing anything." Reed laughed out, loud, as if that explanation was the most absurd thing he had ever heard. "Of course it's yours. Every kid your age walks around with a credit card trying to buy watches that cost thousands of dollars. Do you think we're idiots?" "No, I just want to buy a gift for my mom," Darren insisted, feeling his eyes sting with anger and humiliation. "Well, it looks like someone here needs a lesson on where you belong," Scott said, his tone of voice charged with sarcasm and contempt. Not only did they ignore Darren's words, but they also treated him as if he were invisible, as if his story had no importance at all. It was then that Mrs. Thompson reappeared, looking at the scene with a satisfied air. Her look said that this was exactly what she expected. "Very well, gentlemen. I knew he was trying to do something wrong. You can search it all you want." Darren felt the weight of all the eyes on him. Those passing by the store whispered, some shook their heads in disapproval, while others simply ignored the scene as if it was nothing unusual. A black boy being treated like a criminal just for trying to make an honest purchase, and he had no way to prove otherwise because no one there was willing to listen. No one was willing to believe it. The humiliation was so intense that he almost forgot why he had entered that store in the first place. But one thing he knew, it wouldn't stay that way. Darren stood still, trying to maintain control while the security guards continued to treat him as if he were a dangerous criminal. The feeling of humiliation was almost unbearable. His fists were clenched, but he kept his hands raised, showing that he was not a threat. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. Reed continued to hold Darren's credit card with disdain. Scott kept a watchful look, as if he expected the boy to try something at any moment. The saleswoman, Mrs. Thompson, folded her arms with a discreet smile, pleased to have her prejudices seemingly confirmed. But then Reed decided to check the credit card, figuring it was some kind of cheap forgery or something that could incriminate Darren further. He turned it around and noticed the full name printed there, Darren Carter. Then the name is true. But I bet you stole that card from somewhere, didn't you? Maybe you found it on the street or took it from someone's wallet, Reed said in an annoying tone of voice. I told you the card is mine. I just wanted to buy a gift for my mother. Darren's voice was a mixture of anger and despair. He had never been treated that way, so unfairly. Meanwhile, Scott took Darren's ID card from one of the boys' pockets and opened it. At first, he seemed only interested in finding out if the ID matched the name on the card, something he was already sure wouldn't match. But then his face turned pale. The color faded from his expression as fast as ice melts under the sun. He stared at the document, blinked a few times as if he hoped that what he was seeing was a mistake. Wait, this is a joke, isn't it? He muttered, his voice now sounding less threatening and more worried. What's wrong? Reed asked, annoyed by his colleague's sudden change in behavior. Scott held up the document and showed it to Reed, his eyes wide with pure dread. Look here. Reed picked up the document, and the moment he read the boy's full name and details, his arrogance instantly turned to nervousness. No, this cannot be real. What Reed and Scott didn't know is that Darren had the last name Carter. Not coincidentally. That was not just another name. It was the name of Judge Emily Carter, the most respected and feared woman in the courts of that city. Known for her strict stance, ruthless ethics, and above all for her tireless fight against social injustices, Emily Carter was not only a renowned judge, but she also led a series of commissions and projects against racial discrimination and abuses of power. His sentences and speeches often made headlines and were praised by civil rights groups and criticized by those who preferred to maintain the status quo. Judge Carter? Reed muttered, as if the name had a huge weight on his tongue. Scott took a step back, still clutching his ID card with trembling fingers. He looked at Darren with a completely different expression now. There was no more contempt or sarcasm, just fear and regret. Darren realized that something had changed. He saw the looks of the two security guards oscillate between panic and despair. Those men who minutes ago had treated him like a common delinquent now seemed to be facing a judgment they could not avoid. Listen, boy. It was just a misunderstanding, Reed said, now forcing a nervous smile as he returned Darren's card and ID. We were just trying to protect the store, you know. Security measures and everything else. Darren took his documents back without saying anything. It didn't take a genius to understand what had happened. They weren't trying to apologize because they realized they made a mistake. They were trying to avoid the consequences of having treated the wrong person's child badly. Yes, it was a mistake. That's all, Scott repeated, trying to appear friendly now, though his face betrayed the dread he felt. But Darren wasn't listening anymore. Something inside him had changed. He was furious, yes, but he also felt relieved to finally see these men realize the size of the mistake they had made. What they didn't know is that while that whole scene was unfolding, Darren had managed to send a quick message to his mother. A simple text telling where he was and that something terrible was happening. And outside the store, the doors of a black car had just opened. Elegant shoes touched the ground firmly. Judge Emily Carter had arrived, and she wasn't happy at all. Outside the store, Emily Carter's steady footsteps echoed through the mall's shiny floor. Dressed in an elegant black suit and hair tied in a perfect bun, her presence emanated authority. It was impossible to ignore it. People who saw her pass by immediately recognized her face from the news, but no one dared to approach her. Emily's expression was hard, serious, as if the mere air she breathed was charged with indignation. She had received Darren's message a few minutes before, and knowing her son as she did, she knew he wouldn't make a cry for help for nothing. He had never been the type to dramatize things. Something very serious had happened, and she would make sure to find out what it was. When Emily stopped at the entrance of Horologium & Co., saw exactly what he feared. Darren, standing with clenched fists, his gaze lost in a mixture of humiliation and anger. Around him, two visibly tense security guards and a saleswoman who seemed surprised to see her there. "What's going on here?" Emily's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. There was no need to raise the tone. The seriousness in his words already conveyed all his power. All eyes turned to her. The security guards immediately recognized who she was, but it took Ms. Thompson a few seconds longer to understand who she was dealing with. And when he understood, his face turned pale almost instantly. "Madam, can I help?" Mrs. Thompson stammered, trying to hide the panic in her voice. "The only thing you can do is explain to me why my son was treated like a criminal here," Emily said, advancing a few steps into the store. The security guards exchanged desperate looks. Reed cleared his throat, trying to regain the authoritarian posture that seemed to have evaporated along with his arrogance. "Mrs. Carter, I think there was a misunderstanding." He tried to smile, but the nervousness was evident. "We were just doing our job, a preventive measure, so to speak, just to make sure nothing wrong happened." "Preventive measure?" Emily raised an eyebrow. "So that's how you treat a young man who comes in here to make a legitimate purchase? Do you assume he's a thief before you even allow him to speak?" It wasn't quite like that. The lady here, the saleswoman, called security. He said that the boy was acting suspiciously. "We just followed the protocol." Mrs. Thompson widened her eyes. Now that the security guards had transferred responsibility to her, she seemed unable to maintain her haughty posture. His hands trembled. "Visibly, Mrs. Carter, I just thought that," the saleswoman's voice was shaky, hesitant. "I thought he might be, well, he was alone and looking at the most expensive watches. I never thought that." "You never thought he could be here as a legitimate customer, right? Because it doesn't fit your idea of what a legitimate customer is." Emily interrupted, her eyes fixed on the saleswoman. "But you didn't hesitate to judge him. You didn't hesitate to treat him as someone inferior." I just wanted to protect the store." Mrs. Thompson tried to argue, but her voice sounded weaker and weaker. "Emily," Carter let out a cold laugh without a trace of humor. "Protect the store from what exactly? Of a teenager who wanted to buy a gift for his mother? Perhaps the problem here is not the safety of the store, but the safety of the people you decide to humiliate for no reason at all." Darren watched the scene in silence. He knew that tone of voice of his mother. It was the tone she used in the courts when she was about to destroy the other side's arguments, piece by piece. But now it wasn't just a legal dispute. It was something much more personal. Reed and Scott stood motionless, completely speechless. They knew they were in trouble. And worst of all, they knew they had made an irreversible mistake. Emily Carter was not just an ordinary judge. His influence went far beyond the courtroom. His name carried weight, respect, and a destructive ability to expose injustices. "Let's do the following," Emily said, adjusting her posture as if she was ready to deal with the situation in an official way. "I want to talk to the manager of this store immediately, and I also want the full names of both of you, because what happened here will not go unnoticed." Reed tried to argue. "Please, Mrs. Carter, let's settle this quietly. We don't need to involve other people, right? It was a mistake, just a misunderstanding. We can put that behind us and move on." "Move on?" Emily narrowed her eyes. "How exactly do you expect my son to move on after being treated this way? And if I hadn't been here to defend him, what would have happened to him? Is this how you treat everyone who doesn't fit your ideal customer profile?" "No, ma'am," Scott replied, his voice almost a whisper. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, a mistake that will have consequences. Now bring in the manager." Reed and Scott didn't need any more order. They ran towards the back of the store to call the person in charge. Emily Carter stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the saleswoman, who was trying to hide her dread behind a forced smile. Emily didn't need to scream. His presence was intimidating enough, and everyone there knew that what would happen next would not be pleasant at all for those who committed that injustice. As security guards rushed to fetch the manager, the silence inside the store seemed to intensify. With each passing second, Mrs. Thompson's gazes grew more nervous, and the fear on her face was evident. She knew she had made a mistake, but she still tried to maintain some dignity, clinging to the hope that maybe this was just a nightmare. But for Darren, the sense of humiliation still burned brightly. Even with his mother's presence there, he still felt the weight of the injustice he had suffered. His gaze met hers, and the firmness she saw in her eyes was enough to give him the strength to face it to the end. A few minutes later, a tall, well-dressed man appeared, his face already pale and a forced smile. It was the manager of the store, Andrew Collins, a man who apparently never saw himself in situations like that. "Mrs. Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Andrew Collins, the manager of this store." His voice trembled slightly, despite his effort to sound cordial. Emily analyzed it from top to bottom before answering. "Mr. Collins, I'm here because my son has been treated like a criminal in your shop. I want you to explain to me why this happened, and I suggest that you do not try to soften the situation, because what I saw was a clear and undisguised abuse." Andrew swallowed, clearly unprepared for that kind of confrontation. "Mrs. Carter, I apologize for what happened. My employees were hasty. We must ensure the safety of our products, and sometimes the measures can be excessive." "Excessive?" Emily interrupted, her tone as sharp as a blade. "Putting 2 security guards to search and humiliate a teenager in front of everyone is what you call excessive? What kind of training do you offer here? The training of prejudice? Because that is what has happened here, Mr. Collins. Pure and simple prejudice." The manager looked at the security guards who remained motionless, trying to go unnoticed. He knew that anything he said could make the situation worse. I recognize that it was a mistake. A big mistake, and I can guarantee that everyone involved will be disciplined, including the saleswoman who called security, Mrs. Thompson, who had hitherto tried to remain invisible, let out a short sigh of despair. "Mrs. Carter, I was just trying to protect the store. I didn't know he was your son." Emily narrowed her eyes. "And does that change anything? Because from what I've seen, you made a decision based solely and exclusively on his appearance, without asking anything, without trying to understand the situation. And I wonder, if it was a white boy dressed elegantly, would you have called security?" The woman seemed unable to find a coherent answer. His expression was a mixture of shame and fear. "That's the saddest part. You can't even answer the question because you know I'm right," Emily added, her voice full of indignation. "I promise this will never happen again." Andrew interrupted, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. "And as an apology, our store is willing to offer any watch your child chooses, gratuitously, to show that we are really sorry for what happened." Darren looked at his mother, waiting for her answer. But Emily didn't seem the least bit impressed with the offer. In fact, his gaze only grew colder. "Do you think a free watch will erase what happened here? That a gift will correct an attitude rooted in prejudice and intolerance?" Andrew Gagejou. "No, that is not it, Mrs. Carter. I'm just trying to show that we're really sorry for what happened. It was a horrible mistake, and I take full responsibility." Emily took a deep breath and crossed her arms. "Then here's what you're going to do, Mr. Collins. First, you'll train your team to never make this kind of mistake again. It will ensure that no customer is treated this way, regardless of their appearance, skin color, or social status. And second, I want the full names of the security guards and the saleswoman. They will have to answer for their actions." Andrew nodded vigorously. "Of course, Mrs. Carter. I'll arrange it right away." "Great. And as for the gift you want to give my son," Emily looked at Darren, her eyes finally relaxing a bit. "My son can afford the gift he chose. That's the value of his hard work, and nothing can take that away from him." Andrew didn't dare argue. He signaled for a new saleswoman to come and meet Darren. A young woman, friendly and clearly nervous after watching everything that had just happened. Darren, still feeling awkward about the whole situation, chose the watch he had dreamed of buying. The saleswoman packed him carefully and placed the bag in front of him with a respectful smile. Darren placed the card on the counter and waited for it to be processed. The payment was approved without any problems, but to him, the price of that watch now seemed much higher than what he had planned. Emily placed a firm hand on her son's shoulder. "Are you ready for us to go?" he asked, his voice now softer. "Yes, Mom. Let's go," Darren replied, holding the bag with the gift and feeling that somehow the dignity they tried to take away from him was still there, intact. As they left the store, the manager, the security guards, and the saleswoman were in absolute silence, as if a hurricane had passed through and left a trail of destruction and regret. But what would come next was not over yet, because Emily Carter wasn't known for letting injustices go unpunished. And everyone there knew that the real trial was yet to come. Emily Carter and Darren were about to leave the store when the manager, Andrew Collins, hurried to escort them to the exit. The guilt was visible in their eyes, but it was not the genuine guilt of those who regret having done something wrong. It was the calculated desperation of those who try to save their own skin. "Mrs. Carter, I just want to assure you that everyone involved here will be held accountable. I will provide adequate training for the team, reinforce our protocols, and ensure that this never happens again," Andrew said, his voice coming out in a hurry, almost desperate. Emily stopped and turned to face him. His expression was cold but calm. That calm that precedes an implacable sentence. "Mr. Collins, do you really think this problem will be solved with a facade training and a few fine words? This is not just a problem of your store. It is a structural problem, which reflects a culture of prejudice and hasty judgment. And as long as people like you continue to ignore the real problem, nothing will change." Andrew lowered his head, unable to argue. I understand. We will do whatever it takes to fix this." Emily took a step forward, keeping her gaze fixed on the man. "If I really understood, I would have done something to prevent this from happening. But the truth is, you're only trying to protect your store's reputation. Because that's what really matters to you, isn't it? Your image, your sale. And what makes me most angry is that if my son didn't have the last name he has, you wouldn't even be apologizing right now. He would be defending the behavior of his employees and trying to justify the unjustifiable." Silence spread through the room. Emily's words weighed like a verdict. The young saleswoman who attended to Darren after the incident remained motionless, witnessing something she knew she would never forget. "Mrs. Carter, I'm really sorry. I will do whatever it takes to rectify this situation." Andrew tried to argue, but his voice now sounded like an empty echo. "The only thing I want now is for you to understand what is really at stake here. It's not just about my son being humiliated. It's about all those who go through similar situations every day and have no one to defend them," Emily continued, her voice firm and unwavering. Andrew looked at the security guards, who remained paralyzed, and then at the saleswoman, Mrs. Thompson, who now looked completely defeated. "I'll take the necessary steps, ensure that everyone involved is properly punished and that this does not happen again. I promise." Emily let out a short, impatient sigh. "Empty words don't interest me. I want concrete actions. I want a detailed report on the procedures your store will implement to ensure that this discrimination is not repeated. And more than that, I want those responsible to be officially held accountable." Andrew's face paled even more. He knew he was dealing with someone who wouldn't settle for flimsy promises. "Of course, I'll arrange that. And once again, my sincere apologies." Emily turned to the security guards, Reed and Scott, who now looked smaller, like children caught in a cruel prank. "You two?" His voice was like a sure blow. "I want their full names and their license records, because what you have done today will not simply be swept under the rug. This aggressive and prejudiced approach will have consequences. And if you think you're going to get away with this, think again. Mrs. Carter, please. It was a mistake. We didn't know who he was. Scott tried to argue, his voice weak and desperate. What if he wasn't my son? What would have happened? You would have continued to treat him like a criminal with no right to explanation. They would have continued to humiliate him, perhaps even arrested him for no reason at all. Because for you, he wasn't a customer, it was a threat. Reed opened his mouth to say something, but gave up before he could even utter a word. He knew that there was no possible justification for what they had done. Principal Carter, Andrew said, desperately trying to fix the situation. If you need anything else, please let me know. We will do everything in our power to rectify this. Emily looked at him with controlled contempt. You don't understand, do you? This is not just a problem of this store. It is a problem for the whole of society. And I assure you that I will do my best to make this incident serve as an example that this type of behavior will no longer be tolerated. She looked at Darren, who was still holding the bag with the gift he had bought so hard. Come on, son. We have what we came for. Now it's time for us to make sure that lesson is learned. And so Emily and Darren left the store, leaving behind a trail of fear, shame, and the certainty that true judgment was yet to come. But what those officials didn't know is that what Emily Carter would do next would be far more impactful than any training or apology. When Emily and Darren left the store, the atmosphere behind them was quiet chaos. The employees exchanged frightened looks, trying to process what had just happened. Andrew Collins, the store manager, looked like he had aged years in just a few minutes. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he frantically reached for his cell phone to call the store's headquarters. But while Andrew despaired to protect his reputation, Emily Carter had already begun a series of actions he could never have foreseen. That same evening, Emily sent a detailed email to Horologium & Co.'s board of directors, and to those responsible for the mall's security, describing in detail what had happened. But it didn't stop there. She also contacted a number of journalists and civil rights groups, ensuring that the incident was widely publicized. That would not be a secret. Society needed to see how prejudice still manifested itself in a brutal and unfair way. The next morning, the case was already in all the newspapers and television programs. Headlines read phrases such as, "Son of renowned judge suffers prejudice at luxury store," and "Emily Carter demands justice for her son and all those who suffer discrimination." The repercussion was immediate. Ordinary people, celebrities, and even politicians have spoken out about what happened, strongly condemning the treatment received by Darren. Social networks were buzzing with comments and hashtags, "We're Justicia para Darren," and "Preconcito nunca mais" became trending topics within hours. Meanwhile, at Horologium & Co. an emergency meeting was called. The company's directors watched in horror as security camera footage clearly showed the humiliating treatment Darren had endured. The images left no room for doubt or justification. The company's CEO, Richard Hastings, was an ambitious man and extremely careful about the brand's public image. He knew that this crisis needed to be resolved quickly, before the damage was irreversible. "I want a full report on the incident and all the actions that are being taken to correct this situation. And I want it now," Hastings ordered, his voice sounding like thunder in the meeting room. While the PR team desperately tried to create an official statement that sounded genuine and not just a desperate attempt to avoid a boycott, those directly involved in the incident faced much more immediate consequences. At the store, Andrew Collins stood before his direct boss, an impassive man named Michael Graves, sent especially by the head office to resolve the situation. "You let it get out of hand, Andrew. This store has just become the center of a national scandal, and I'll make sure you pay the price for it," Michael said, his words sharp as blades. "Mr. Graves, I swear I'm doing everything I can to fix this. I've already arranged emergency training for the entire team and—" "Training?" Michael interrupted with a bitter laugh. "Do you really think this will fix what happened? You allowed a deep-rooted prejudice to destroy the image of our store in a few hours. And as a manager, the responsibility is all yours. He is fired." Andrew opened his mouth to protest, but he knew there were no arguments he could make. The decision was already made. As for the security guards, Reed and Scott, the situation was even worse. An official complaint had been made by Emily Carter against both. They were removed from their positions immediately, while their licenses to work as security guards were officially suspended for investigation. Their careers had been destroyed in an instant. And the saleswoman, Mrs. Thompson, who had started all that tragedy with her rash denunciation? She was called to the manager's office and told she was being fired for inappropriate conduct and violating company policies. His attempts to justify himself were ignored. "You made a decision based on prejudice and destroyed the reputation of our store. There's no room for people like you here," Michael Graves had said before dismissing her with a cold gesture. Mrs. Thompson walked out of the store with trembling steps, her eyes teary and her mind in complete chaos. Nothing could repair the mistake he had made. Days later, in a live-streamed press conference, Emily Carter made a powerful statement. "What happened to my son is just one example of something much bigger and more cruel. Every day, people are humiliated, discredited, and treated as criminals simply because of their appearance. This type of discrimination needs to end, and I will do my best to make sure that happens, not just for Darren, but for all those who have no one to defend them." The audience gave a standing ovation, and the recording of that speech quickly went viral, inspiring thousands of people to share their own stories of discrimination and prejudice. Darren watched all of this with a mixture of pride and learning. He knew that his mother would not let that injustice be forgotten, and now, more than ever, he understood the importance of not being silent in the face of prejudice. Days later, Darren's life began to return to normal. The confusion in the store and all the turmoil that followed seemed almost unreal. But the marks of that episode were still there, invisible but present. It was not easy to forget the way he was treated, how he was judged for his appearance and humiliated for no reason at all. However, something positive had come out of all that pain. Emily Carter, his mother, had made good on her promise to turn that event into a public lesson in respect and dignity. Its anti-discrimination campaign went viral in such a way that several establishments began to review their policies and properly train their staff to prevent similar incidents from occurring. But the most important thing was not the social impact, it was the personal impact. It was late at night when Emily entered Darren's room. He was sitting on the bed holding the watch he had bought with so much effort. He swirled the object between his fingers as if looking for some hidden meaning in it. Thinking about what happened, Emily asked softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Darren sighed and shook his head. "It's hard not to think. I know you did what was right, but deep down, I wonder if it would have been different if I hadn't been his son. If I were just another, ordinary boy, with no one to protect me." Emily was silent for a moment. The look in his eyes was one of pain and determination. "You're right, and that's exactly why I did what I did. Because I know that, unfortunately, not everyone has someone to defend them. And this needs to change. I can't solve all the problems in the world, Darren, but I can guarantee that at least some people think twice before acting with prejudice." Darren looked at his mother and tried to smile. "You've always been amazing at this. Turn the worst-case scenario into something that makes people open their eyes. That's what I do. But what really matters here is what you've learned from all of this. Because the world will always try to put you down, to diminish you for what you are. But no one can take away your dignity, Darren. No one can define who you are except yourself." Darren lowered his eyes, reflecting on those words. All his life, his mother had taught him to be strong, never to bow down to injustice, but now, more than ever, he understood the true meaning of that lesson. "I'll never let them define me. Never again," he said, with a firmness he had not felt before. Emily smiled and held her son's hand. "That's right, because your dignity is something that no one can take away from you, and you need to defend that always, regardless of who is trying to bring you down." Darren took a deep breath and looked again at the clock he was still holding. "I bought this for you. It was supposed to be a birthday present, and it ended up turning into something totally different." "No, Darren. This gift has become something much more special than you might think," Emily replied. taking the watch from her hands and watching it fondly. "Because it represents your effort, your sacrifice, and above all, your character. Everything you've gone through to achieve this shows what an amazing person you are, and I couldn't be prouder." Darren felt his eyes water, but he didn't let the tears fall. "Happy birthday, Mom. I hope you like it. I love it, and I'm going to wear it every day as a reminder of how blessed I am to have a child like you." They embraced, and in that moment, the full weight of the injustice Darren had faced seemed to finally dissipate, because he understood that the real victory was not only in the fact that he exposed that discrimination to the world. It was in his ability to remain whole, strong, and dignified, even when everything seemed to be against him. The next day, Darren and Emily were invited to a television program to talk about what happened and the repercussions that the case had generated. During the interview, Darren talked about what he had learned from all of this. "If there's one thing I want people to understand, it's that no one can be judged by their appearance, and no one should need to have someone powerful to protect them just to be treated with respect. This should be guaranteed to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The audience cheered, and Darren's words echoed across the country. From that moment on, he knew he had found his own voice, and that he would use that voice to fight for justice, not only for him, but for all those who suffer in silence. And so, the boy who was once humiliated for trying to buy a gift for his mother became an inspiration to thousands of people, proving that true power lies in never allowing others to define who you are.